One morning in 1950, agents knocked on Paul Robeson's door. They wanted his passport. The football star, singer, and actor had become too dangerous. His crime was telling the world a shocking truth about America. The government locked him inside the country for 8 years. His records vanished. His name disappeared from history books. His career died. But he never stopped fighting. And once you hear the full story of why they really banned him, you might feel sick to your stomach. Paul Robeson was born on April 9, 1898, in Princeton, New Jersey. His father, William Drew Robeson, had once been a slave. At just 15, William escaped from a plantation in North Carolina. He made it to freedom through the Underground Railroad and later fought for the Union Army in the Civil War. In 1876, he earned a theology degree and became a Presbyterian minister. Paul's mother, Maria Louisa Bastille, came from a respected mixed-race Quaker family. Paul was the youngest of 5 children, growing up in a home where education and dignity were everything. But Princeton wasn't kind to black families. When Paul was just 3, his father was forced out of his church by white financiers, even though the black congregation supported him completely. It wasn't about religion, it was racism. William had spoken out against unfair treatment of black workers. That made him a target. He lost his position, and their family slipped into poverty. Then came another blow. In 1904, when Paul was 6, his mother died in a house fire. She had been almost completely blind. Paul, his father, and brother Ben had to move into an attic above a store. It was a hard life. Finally, in 1910, William found work at another church. But those early years left their mark. Paul saw struggle, he saw unfairness, and he learned how to endure. In 1912, at age 14, Paul joined Somerville High School. It wasn't easy. The principal, Mr. Ackerman, didn't like seeing a black student shine. But Paul didn't just shine, he dominated. Straight A's, school newspaper, glee club, acting in Shakespeare plays, debating. He did it all. His teachers loved him. His classmates admired him. At graduation, he delivered Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" speech. And the whole room fell silent. People said his voice could stop time. He later won a statewide scholarship competition for Rutgers. He scored higher than anyone else in the exam's history. That test covered 4 full years of high school material. And he beat kids who only studied for 1. In 1915, Paul entered Rutgers. He was the 3rd black student in the school's history. On the first day of football tryouts, a white player stomped on Paul's hand, trying to break it. Paul almost fought back, but the coach shouted that he made the varsity. Paul helped the attacker up. That's the kind of man he was. On the field, Paul was unstoppable. At 6 feet 3 inches and 210 pounds, he smashed crates with his forearms for training. Teams feared him. He played offense and defense. In one game against an undefeated military team, Paul's defense was so good that the other side only got 1 first down. One journalist joked they weren't playing against 11 players, they were playing against 11 Robesons. He was All-American twice. But football was just one part of it. Paul earned 15 varsity letters, 4 in football, 3 in basketball, 3 in baseball, and 2 in track. In class, he was brilliant. Phi Beta Kappa, 4-time oratory champion, debating team, glee club, valedictorian. He even mastered over 20 languages. At Rutgers, he wasn't just a student, he was a phenomenon. After graduation, he went to law school, first New York University, then Columbia. At the same time, he played pro football for the Akron Pros in 1921 and the Milwaukee Badgers in 1922. He also coached and performed in plays, all while earning a law degree. He even sang at big events in Harlem. He wasn't trying to be famous. He was just good at everything. In law school, he met Essie Good. She was a chemist, smart and determined. She saw Paul's potential and pushed him toward acting. They married in 1921. Essie gave up her career to support Paul's dreams, but their marriage wasn't easy. Paul had affairs, many. One almost ended it, but Essie stayed. In 1930, she published a biography about Paul. He didn't like how she described him, but she stood by her version. In 1923, Paul graduated from Columbia and joined a top law firm. He was the only black lawyer there. His work was good, and his boss praised him. But one day, a white stenographer refused to take his dictation. She wouldn't work with a black man. Paul complained. The firm told him it would be hard to win over white clients anyway. They offered to move him to Harlem to serve only black clients. Paul said no. He quit. And just like that, law was over. But acting was waiting. In 1924, Paul starred in All God's Chillun Got Wings. It was a bold play about an interracial marriage. In one scene, he kissed a white actress. That moment set off a national storm. Headlines screamed. The Ku Klux Klan made threats. Bomb threats poured in. On opening night, police surrounded the theater. But Paul didn't flinch. His performance was so powerful that even critics who hated the play praised him. One wrote, "Paul Robeson is a finer actor than any white member of the cast." That kiss had shaken America, and Paul had made his mark. Then came The Emperor Jones in 1925, another Eugene O'Neill play. Paul played Brutus Jones, a man who becomes emperor, only to be crushed by guilt and madness. It was nearly a one-man show, a test of range and power. Paul passed with ease. When the play moved to London, critics were stunned. His voice, his emotion, his control. It was unlike anything they'd seen. Paul Robeson had become more than just a football hero, scholar, or singer. He was now a force on the world stage. From 1927 to 1939, he and his wife Essie made England their home. He called the country warm and friendly and unprejudiced. And during that time, his career exploded. He wasn't just a singer or actor anymore. He was a star among intellectuals and writers. He met people like H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and Rebecca West. Doors that were closed in America opened wide in Europe. Then came 1928. That's when Robeson played Joe in the London premiere of Showboat. The part was written with him in mind, even though he had missed the Broadway debut, and when he sang Old Man River, everything changed. The song, about the pain of black laborers and the endless flow of the river, hit people hard. It wasn't just a song anymore. It became Robeson's anthem. Even the Prince of Wales asked him to perform it at Buckingham Palace. He would play Joe 4 times in his life. London in 1928, Broadway in 1932, the film in 1936, and again in Los Angeles in 1940. The original cast album didn't even feature his voice due to contracts, but he still recorded Old Man River separately that same year. But Robeson didn't just grow as a performer in Europe. He grew as a thinker. In 1928, Labour MPs invited him to lunch at the House of Commons. He sat next to former Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald and talked politics. He met people who told him about Shapurji Saklatvala, a communist MP of color from India. But the most eye-opening moment came when he met Welsh coal miners. They had walked from Rhondda to London to protest unsafe conditions and low pay. They sang together, and Robeson was moved. He said, It's from the miners in Wales that I first understood the struggle of Negro and white together. One day, he saw a rich man yell at a chauffeur. In that moment, Robeson realized something. Racism and class oppression were connected. It wasn't just about skin color, it was about power. Robeson also began performing Negro Spirituals with new purpose. In 1924 and 1925, he teamed up with Lawrence Brown, a pianist and arranger. Together, they turned these songs into something that belonged on the world's finest stages. He wasn't just singing for applause, he was preserving the voices of his ancestors. These songs weren't simple folk tunes. They were rich with history and pain. He brought them to places like Carnegie Hall in 1929 and showed that spirituals were just as worthy as European classics. His concerts blended different musical traditions to make one simple point: black music matters. But even with all this success, Robeson refused to compromise. He would not perform for segregated audiences. Promoters warned him he'd lose money. He didn't care. In his contracts, he added a rule: no racial separation. In 1948, officials in Asheville, North Carolina, tried to force segregated seating. His team said no. The same thing happened in Durham, Savannah, and other southern cities. He lost shows, but he never gave in. In June 1948, in Greensboro, he said, "There won't be any Jim Crow cars on the Freedom Train." Then came December 1934. Robeson traveled to the Soviet Union with his wife and biographer. The trip nearly ended in Berlin, where Nazi troops threatened them. But in Moscow, the welcome was completely different. Sergei Eisenstein, the famous Soviet filmmaker, greeted him like an old friend. Eisenstein even wanted Robeson to star in a film about the Haitian Revolution. That film never happened, but the friendship did. At a reception in Moscow, Eisenstein introduced him as the greatest American singer. Robeson sang labor songs, Russian pieces, spirituals, and even a Cossack lullaby. And none of this was random. He had spent 2 years learning Russian and studying the country's culture. Something changed in Robeson during that visit. He said, "Here I am, not a Negro, but a human being for the first time in my life." That feeling hit him hard. Children approached him with respect. People shook his hand in the street. There were no racial barriers. He even noticed that spirituals reminded Russians of their own folk music. It was an emotional connection he had never felt before. His wife said this visit reignited his love for film. At the same time, back in Britain, he was one of the most popular actors in cinema. But while he was famous in the West, he felt like a full human being in the East. One thing that stood out to him in the USSR was Article 123 of their Constitution. It banned racial discrimination outright. For Robeson, this was groundbreaking. In the 1930s, America was still enforcing segregation laws. But the Soviet Union had written racial equality into its legal system. He saw this in action. Different races interacted freely. To Robeson, this proved that a society could be built on fairness. As a trained lawyer, he understood the power of the law. He later talked about Article 123 in speeches and said it showed how real change could happen. Not just promises, but actual structure. But not everything he said aged well. During that same 1934 trip, Robeson made a statement that would later haunt him. He said, "Anybody who lifts his hand against the Soviet government ought to be shot." He was responding to news of executions for so-called counter-revolutionaries. He believed the Soviet government was protecting a just society. "This is home to me," he said. "There is no terror here." He praised their housing and the lack of slums. But this was right before the Great Purge, which would kill millions. Robeson didn't know that yet, but his defense of the regime would be used against him for the rest of his life. From 1934 to 1939, his activism only grew. He threw himself into labor causes. "Democracy cannot exist without labor unions," he said. He supported left-wing unions and performed at their events. He believed workers, black, white, or otherwise, had to stand together. During the Spanish Civil War, he sided with the anti-fascist Republicans. In 1937, at London's Albert Hall, he said, "The artist must elect to fight for freedom or slavery. I have made my choice." He raised thousands of dollars, sang for troops, and even went to Spain in 1938 to visit the front lines. There, he learned about Oliver Law, a black American who died fighting fascism. Robeson wanted to make a movie about him. Even Ernest Hemingway tried to help, but Hollywood refused. Robeson said the reason was simple: the same interests that block every effort to help Spain control the motion picture industry. In October 1943, Paul Robeson stepped onto the Broadway stage as Othello. It wasn't just another performance. He was the first black actor to take that role on Broadway. The production lasted 296 shows, the longest run for any Shakespeare play in Broadway history. Even now, more than 80 years later, no one has broken that record. Robeson had played Othello before, in London in 1930, and later in college towns like Cambridge and Princeton. But this was different. This was Broadway. He accepted only $1,500 a week, even though he could earn up to $2,500 a night just by singing. He lost 35 pounds to fit the part, dropping down to his old football weight of 230 pounds. He even had the final say on casting and costumes, something unheard of at the time. Playing opposite him as Iago was Jose Ferrer. The critics loved them, but for Robeson, it wasn't about reviews. He said he wasn't just acting, he was speaking for every black person, using Shakespeare's words to do it. And when people cheered, he said it felt like Jim Crow laws had been broken on stage. Robeson didn't stop with theater. He took his fight to film. In the 1930s, Hollywood was a tough place for any black actor. Roles were limited, often insulting, but Robeson pushed for more. In Sanders of the River, 1935, he played a proud African chief named Bosambo. At first, the film seemed respectful, but the producers changed it behind his back, turning it into a colonialist mess. Robeson was furious. He publicly rejected the movie and swore he'd never work with the producer again. That was bold in 1935. Very bold. Then came Showboat, 1936, where Robeson sang Old Man River. It wasn't just a song anymore. He gave it power. He made it mean something. A film historian later called it the most powerful 4 minutes of American cinema in the 1930s. Robeson kept acting, kept singing, and kept fighting for better roles. He demanded character dignity. He wanted approval over scripts. That was almost impossible for a black actor back then. But Robeson wasn't like anyone else. After World War II, while most of America was celebrating victory, Robeson looked at what was happening at home. Between 1945 and 1946, at least 56 black Americans were lynched. Some were even veterans who had fought in the war. Robeson couldn't stay silent. He formed the American Crusade Against Lynching. It got support from people like Albert Einstein and Lena Horne, but the NAACP stayed away. They thought Robeson was too radical. On September 23, 1946, he went to the White House to talk to President Truman. The meeting didn't go well. Truman said the time wasn't right for anti-lynching laws. Robeson told him that if the government wouldn't protect black people, they'd have to protect themselves. Then he compared America's silence on lynching to the Nazis' crimes. Truman ended the meeting. Outside, a reporter asked if Robeson believed in turning the other cheek. He said, "If someone hit me on one cheek, I'd tear his head off before he could hit me on the other one." That same year, Robeson was honored. On October 18, 1945, he received the Spingarn Medal, the highest award from the NAACP. He was their 30th recipient. Previous winners included W.E.B. Du Bois. Later ones would include Martin Luther King Jr. and Maya Angelou. The medal was gold and worth $100. It was awarded at a grand banquet in New York's Hotel Biltmore. They were honoring Robeson's work in theater, concerts, and civil rights. It was a proud moment. But it wouldn't last long. The political mood was changing. Robeson was being watched. As the Cold War began, Robeson got louder. In 1946, during a meeting with Truman, he said the British Empire had enslaved millions. That didn't sit well. In the next few years, he performed concerts across the United States and Europe, giving political speeches too. He called for peace with the Soviet Union. In 1949, at a peace conference in Paris, he made a speech that changed everything. He said Americans didn't want war with Russia. But a twisted version of his words made headlines back home. Newspapers claimed Robeson had said Black Americans would never fight against the Soviets. He was branded a traitor. The backlash came fast. On July 18, 1949, Congress called in Jackie Robinson to speak. They wanted him to publicly disagree with Robeson. Robinson testified. Meanwhile, Robeson's income collapsed, from over $150,000 a year to less than $3,000. Venues canceled shows. When he tried to perform in Peekskill, New York, violence erupted. Protesters attacked. 13 people were seriously injured. Even war heroes were beaten. The police stood by or joined in. But Robeson refused to fight back in public. He said arguing with Robinson would only make things worse. On a summer morning in 1950, 2 United States government agents knocked on Paul Robeson's door. They weren't there for a visit. They demanded his passport. No warning, no charge, just a sudden order to hand it over. Robeson didn't give in. He said no. A week later, the State Department went ahead anyway. They publicly canceled his passport and told every United States border officer to stop him if he tried to leave the country. Paul Robeson wasn't just any citizen. He was one of the most famous men in the world. He had performed in over 25 countries, spoken in dozens of languages, and used his voice, not just to sing, but to speak truth. He had criticized racism in the United States, praised the Soviet Union's anti-racism stance, and spoken against the Korean War. The government didn't like that. So they silenced him. The excuse? They said his speeches about racism should not be aired in foreign countries. That wasn't just censorship, it was punishment. Behind closed doors, State Department officials feared that Robeson was telling the world what they didn't want anyone to hear. A black man exposing American hypocrisy during the Cold War? That was dangerous to them. His career collapsed almost overnight. Before the ban, he earned $150,000 a year. After, less than $3,000. That's a 98% drop. Concerts in Europe were canceled. Plans in Canada, Mexico, and the West Indies all shut down. Some of those countries didn't even require a passport, but Robeson was still blocked. It wasn't just about travel. It was about erasing him. Newsreels were cut, recordings destroyed. His name vanished from football history. He wasn't just trapped in the United States. He was being wiped out. 3 days after the ban became official, the State Department gave him a choice: He could get his passport back if he promised to stop speaking abroad. Later, they added more conditions. Sign a paper saying he wasn't a communist. Swear loyalty to the United States. Robeson refused, every time. He believed in free speech more than comfort. He believed in standing up, no matter the cost. In December 1950, Robeson sued the government. He said they violated his First and Fifth Amendment rights. The right to speak, the right to earn a living. On April 20th, 1951, the court said it had no power to rule. They didn't help him. 3 days later, he filed an appeal. The fight dragged on for years. By 1955, the final blow came. A judge ruled the government had every right to take his passport. That ruling made it official. Paul Robeson was now a prisoner in his own country. He wasn't behind bars, but his borders were locked. His quote afterward said it all. "It's rather absurd that I can't travel because of my friendship for the Soviet people and all people." His life's work was now a threat to United States policy, and for that, they tried to destroy him. But Robeson wasn't done. On June 12, 1956, he stood before the House Un-American Activities Committee. They wanted him to name names, to disown his views, to say he was sorry. He didn't. When they asked about the Communist Party, he roared, "I invoke the Fifth Amendment," loudly. He mocked the room. "I have medals for diction," he added. Then they asked why he supported Russia. He replied, "In Russia, I felt like a full human being. No color prejudice." When they pressed him about Stalin, he shot back, "I will not discuss Stalin with the people who have murdered 60 million of my people." He didn't flinch. He didn't bow. And then came his final blow. "You are the un-Americans. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves." The room fell silent. The chairman adjourned the hearing. They didn't even let him finish his statement. But his words had already hit their mark. Paul Robeson wasn't just fighting for his own rights. He was fighting for all voices trying to speak the truth. Even when they took his passport, his career, and his money, he never gave them his dignity. In 1958, 8 years after the nightmare began, the Supreme Court finally ended it. In a different case, Kent versus Dulles, they ruled that passports couldn't be denied without due process. Robeson's travel rights were restored, but those 8 years were stolen. As soon as he had that passport in his hand, he and his wife Essie flew to Europe and made London their home base. He was 60 years old, but the fire in him hadn't dimmed. That summer, he stepped onto the stage at Royal Albert Hall. The place was packed, every seat taken, and when he sang, it was like time stopped. That performance wasn't just a concert, it was a comeback. Over the next few months, he performed 28 more times across the UK. Some people in the press and even Parliament didn't want him there, but the crowds loved him. His voice was still strong, and his presence was as powerful as ever. Then, in October 1959, Robeson did something no black performer had ever done before. He sang at St. Paul's Cathedral in London during a church service. That cathedral had been standing for over 1,000 years. It had never allowed a black performer to sing there in any official way. But that night, Robeson's deep, rich voice echoed through those massive stone walls. He sang spirituals and classical pieces that brought many in the audience to tears. Earlier that same year, he had also played Othello in Stratford-upon-Avon, alongside rising stars like Albert Finney and Diana Rigg. But singing in St. Paul's? That was history. It wasn't just about music. It was about breaking barriers that had stood for centuries. A year later, in October 1960, Robeson went on what would be his final international tour. This time, it was Australia and New Zealand. He performed 20 concerts in just 8 weeks, and earned over $100,000, money he badly needed after years of being shut out in the United States. He played 4 shows in Sydney, 3 in Melbourne, and even 2 in far-off Perth. In Brisbane, 5,000 people filled Festival Hall to hear him sing. And in Sydney, he performed at the construction site of the future Opera House. That hadn't happened before. No artist had done it. His set list was always the same: classical songs, then spirituals, then folk music from around the world. He even sang Russian songs and Scottish ballads. And everywhere he went, people stood and cheered. But Robeson didn't just sing. In Auckland, he spoke out. He said that socialist countries wanted peace, and he called out the mistreatment of the Maori people. In Sydney, he met Faith Bandler, who showed him a short film about Aboriginal Australians living in horrible conditions. Robeson watched in silence, tears streaming down his face. He was heartbroken and furious. He began speaking out at every chance he got. He demanded full rights for Aboriginal Australians. He said they weren't backward. He said society was backward for calling them that. That one sentence, "There's no such thing as a backward human being," became a rallying cry. Activists held on to it for years, and while many Australians didn't like what he said, it didn't matter. His words stuck. They made people think. They made people act. Robeson returned to the United States quietly after that. His health began to decline, but the world didn't forget him. When he passed away on January 23, 1976, people from all over the globe paid tribute. 2 years later, the United Nations held a meeting on what would have been his 80th birthday to honor him. The very next day, he got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame at 6660 Hollywood Boulevard. And later that year, the UN gave him a special award for fighting apartheid. In 1979, a short film about his life, narrated by Sidney Poitier, won an Oscar. Honors kept coming. In 1995, he was added to the College Football Hall of Fame. In 1998, he received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. New Jersey declared April 9th as Paul Robeson Day. That same year, events celebrating his 100th birthday were held in cities across the United States and in London.